Okay, so now we're going to get into the ListView control. So ListViews are going to be used to display a list of items and then allow the user to select an item from that list. The getItems method is going to return an observable list object with the items in the list view. We can then go ahead and select an item and also its index. So we'll be able to retrieve both of these using the getSelectedItem and the getSelectedIndex methods. So we have a little bit of an example right here where we are creating a list view of strings. So we're specifying the data type of the individual items in that list view. We give it a name, so we're going to call this the color list view, and then we will assign to it a new list view object. We're then going to this very first line that comes after it, we're going to be setting the preferred size, basically setting up the dimensions for the list view. So you can kind of think of that like the dimensions for the entire application window, where we're specifying a width and a height. So in this case, I'm doing 100 by 100. The next line, this is where we're using that getItems method to go ahead and retrieve the list of items inside of that list view. In this case, when we first use getItems, that list is initially empty. So we're going to use the addAll method to go ahead and just add several items to it at once. So in this case, I'm adding 3 colors to a color list view. So I'm putting in yellow, purple, and brown as 3 strings. We can then use the getSelectedItem method. So we're creating a string that I call selected. We're using the color list view. We need to call the getSelectionModel method on our list view. So that's going to give us the selection model, and from there we can go ahead and get things like the selected item, or in this very last line we can get the selected index. One thing to note about getSelectedIndex is that if nothing in the list view is currently selected, then that method would give you -1. And of course with the getSelectedItem, that would just give you a null or possibly an empty string to match the data type. So when we're dealing with list views, we're going to select one of the items inside of it. So how do we handle when the user clicks an item in that list view? So a change event is going to occur when an item is selected in a list view. The listener is going to be registered with the selected item in the list view. So if we take a look right here, we have our color list view. Again, we need to get the selection model. We're then going to get the selected items properties. So we're calling this method selected item property. This allows us to add the event listener directly to the item that is being selected from that list view. So the way that we handle event registration with our list views is that we are technically registering that to the actual items in the list view rather than necessarily the list view itself. So in this case, we're going to do that, and then we're going to use a lambda expression to provide some kind of code for handling that change event. We also have a couple of methods for being able to put items into our lists. So we saw that addAll method already that allows you to append several items to a list view. So if we already have some content, like a couple of items in that list view to begin with, when we use addAll, it's going to add more of those, just append those to the end of the list. We could also use the setAll method. That's going to replace all of the existing items with a new list of items. So it essentially is going to erase everything that's currently in the list view and then just add in all of this new these new items that you specified. So in a moment, I'll talk a little bit about initializing list views with either arrays or array lists. For now, I'm going to exclude these. The next thing I want to go ahead and mention just briefly is that we're going to take a look at different selection modes. So we're going to see a multiple selection mode and a single selection mode. By default, it starts off in single selection mode, and we can change it to multiple, allowing you to pick multiple items in the list. But before we get into too much detail about this, let's go ahead and actually try to put together a simple example using a couple of the things that we've seen so far. So we'll go ahead and minimize this. I'll come over to NetBeans. So go ahead and make a new project. This will be a new JavaFX application. Go ahead and click Next. And right here for the project name, I'll go ahead and call this my ListView demo, since we'll go ahead and test out a couple of the characteristics of a list view here. Click Finish. Go ahead and do a little bit of cleanup on the code, removing any of the extra comments that we're not going to need. Go ahead and remove all of the extra code in the start method. And I'll also go ahead and move the main method to the top of the program. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to go ahead and remove the two classes that I will not be using, which are button and stack pane. Just go ahead and get rid of those. Right here, I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of controls and a container for the content that I'm going to put into this application. So obviously, since this is the ListView demo, do an import for javafx.scene.control.listview. So make sure that we're importing that so we can go ahead and use our ListView class. I'll also go ahead and include a label. So do javafx.scene.control.label. And then on top of this, I'm going to go ahead and bring in a VBox for my container. So do import javafx.scene.layout.vbox. Go ahead and save that. So then right here, we'll go ahead and start putting together the code for this. So first, I'm going to go ahead and create my list view. So this is going to be a list view specifically of strings. I'm going to call this my option list view. Say this is equal to a new list view. I'll have those two angular brackets, so this is going to make up our diamond operator. And then the that pair of parentheses to indicate that we're calling the constructor. And then underneath this, I'll go ahead and immediately just add in the items, just populate my list. So I'm going to do option list view dot get items dot add all. And for this example, I'll go ahead and just do two items. So we're going to do option 1 and option 2. Oops. And then after this, we'll go ahead and create our label. So we're going to have a label. I'll just go ahead and call it label in all lowercase. This will be equal to a new label. And right here, we're going to go ahead and start off by just saying option 1. So from here, what we want to go ahead and do is put these into a VBox. I'm going to say VBox, we'll just call it VBox in all lowercase. This is equal to a new VBox. Right here, we're going to go ahead and specify a spacing of, let's say, 10. And then we'll do option list view and our label. Let's save that. Then we'll go ahead and create our scene. So be equal to a new scene object. We're using the VBox as our root node for this. We'll go ahead and set it to 300 by 300. And then we'll go ahead and get these stage all set up. So we'll do primary stage dot set scene. We'll do primary stage dot set title. For the title, let's go ahead and make this our list view demo. And then we'll go ahead and make sure that this is actually displaying. So we'll do primary stage dot show. Go ahead and save that. Primary stage. Go ahead and run this just real quick to see how the interface looks. So we've got our two options right here, and you'll notice that the list view itself, the height of it, is pretty long, and we've got a lot of extra rows and columns in this kind of alternating white and gray pattern. So ideally, I don't really need it to be quite as tall as it is. It also doesn't really need to be as wide as it is. So I'm going to take advantage of that set pref method that I mentioned previously. So we'll go ahead and do that right here. We're going to do option list view dot set pref. So I'm going to do set pref size. So this allows us to specify both a width and a height. So we'll go ahead and do 100 and 100. So we're going to just shrink down those dimensions a little bit. So if we run this again, it should be a little bit smaller now. Yeah. So we've got the height a little bit shorter, and the width, primarily the width is going to try to match up with the width of the scene itself. So the 300 is primarily what it's going to take advantage of there. So I'm not going to worry too much about the width. Okay, so now that we've got our list view and our label kind of set up right here, if I click on one of these, you can see it kind of highlighted to show me which item I've selected. If I click the one underneath it, see the same thing. Only the ones that I've specified are actually clickable. But as you'll probably notice, whenever I select one of these, the label doesn't change, even though that kind of seems like what I'm intending for this to do. The reason that it's not doing anything yet is because we haven't registered our event handler. So let's go ahead and do that next. So let's say that after I've set up the controls, but before I start doing the container, maybe right here is where I'll go ahead and put in my event handler. So I'm going to do this as a lambda expression. So I'm going to do my option list view, do get selection model, and I'll mention now, whenever you're dealing with something about selected items, whether that's going through this code right here where we're going to set up an event listener with our selected item, or when you need to get the index or the value of a selected item, you will very frequently be making use out of this get selection model method. So always try to remember that when you're working with list views and you need to see something about your selected items, you're probably going to need to include this method somewhere in there. So for this one, we're going to do get selection model, and then we're going to do the selected item property. So we want to go ahead and get the properties of our selected item, and specifically what we want to do is go ahead and add an event listener. So we're going to do add listener here. And so for this one, we're going to do event, and then do our lambda expression. And inside of here, what I want this to go ahead and do is whenever I select one of the two options, whether that's option 1 or option 2, I just want to go ahead and change the content of my label to match that. So what I can go ahead and do here is option 1 is going to be at index 0, or position 0 in my list view, and option 2 is going to be at position 1. So just like our arrays, if you remember those, the positions of the different items in our list view are going to be 0 based. So the very first item that we see in the list is technically going to be at position 0. So we'll go ahead and do an if statement here and say if our option list view dot get selection model dot get selected index. So if this is equal to 0, then what we want to go ahead and do right here is just change the label. We'll go ahead and set its text to be option 1. So I'm going to do label.setText to option 1. Alternatively, if it is 1, so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and write this as if it were going to be a bit more scalable, as if we were going to add more items to this list view later. So I'm going to say else if, and then again do option list view dot get selection model dot get selected index, and this time I'm going to say if that is equal to 1, then we're going to do label dot set text, and it's going to be option 2. So we can save that, and so now if I go ahead and run this, I can start changing my selection inside of this list view. So I go ahead and choose option 2. This is going to update to say option 2. If I choose option 1, it changes to option 1. You just kind of alternate between those. So we now have some behavior to go with our list view. So we'll go ahead and close this for a moment, come back over here. And so the next thing I want to talk about is going to be dealing with these selection modes that I kind of noted before we worked on that program. So we can choose between single selection mode or multiple selection mode. With the single selection mode, what we just saw, we can only select one item in the list view at a time. with multiple selection view, what we're going to take a look at in just a moment. Multiple items can be selected using either the shift or the control key and then a button click. So the following code shows how to set the selection mode. So again, because this is dealing with selections in some way, again, you're going to see that getSelectionModel method. So we're seeing, in this case, ListView.getSelectionModel.setSelectionMode, and then what we're passing in is going to be a selection mode, either multiple or single. And then assuming that multiple selection mode is set, we can use the following code to retrieve multiple selected items and their indices. So if we want to be able to get multiple items at once, we can use either getSelectedItems or getSelectedIndices. So pretty much matches up with what we saw before, getSelectedItem and getSelectedIndex. We're just changing it so that it's plural now to indicate that there's potentially multiple selections being made. So coming back over to our program, go ahead and make one more adjustment to this. So the first thing I want to go ahead and do is make sure that I'm setting this up to use multiple selection mode. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right here where I'm dealing with all of the characteristics for my list view. So go ahead and add another line here. We're going to do option list view dot get selection mode or selection model. And then from here, we're going to go ahead and set the selection mode. And inside of here, what I need to put in is going to be my selection mode and then a constant for either single or multiple. So I'm going to do selection mode dot, in this case, multiple. Go ahead and choose that. Go ahead and save that. And one of the things to note when I let it autocomplete with adding this constant is it also went ahead and added the class that I'm going to need for this, which is the selection mode right here. So if we take a quick look up here, we can see the import for this, where we're getting the selection mode from this control package. So the next thing I need to go ahead and do, now that I've got my selection mode set to multiple, I want to go ahead and add one more condition right here to let me know what should happen whenever I have both option 1 and option 2 selected. So one of the things to note is that getSelectedIndex can still be used even when you're in multiple selection mode. The way that it's going to behave now is it's always going to keep track of the last thing that you clicked on. So even if you try to select multiple things by using the control or the shift key, whatever you click on at the very end of making that selection, that's the thing that's going to be accounted for with getSelectedIndex or getSelectedItem. So because of that, this if and this else if right here are going to be keeping track of the last thing that I clicked on, so that kind of overrides anything that I add after it. So if I were to add another condition right here, say like another else if, to check if both items are selected, these two right here will kind of interfere with that. So what I need to go ahead and do is include a check to see if both of them are selected at the very top. So I'm going to go ahead and make that my first if statement. So my first condition that I'm checking for is if both are selected. Then we'll go ahead and modify this to this labels text to specify that both options are selected. Otherwise, we can go ahead and just do a check for the individual index, whether that's just 0 or 1. So we can go ahead and set it up with option 1 or option 2. So the way that I'm going to go about checking to see if both of these are selected, let's go ahead and start writing this out. So this is going to be another if right here. So we're going to say if our option list view dot get selection model dot get selected indices. So I'm going to go ahead and check for multiple indices, and what's going to happen is when I use this get selected indices method, that's going to give me back an observable list of all of the indices that I've currently selected. So if I click both of these, it would give me an observable list with integers 0 and 1. So what I'm interested in is the fact that multiple things have been selected, which means that I know a little bit about the size of that observable list. So if I know something about the size of the observable list, I can go ahead and use that as my condition to determine if both of these options are selected. So what I'm going to go ahead and say is use this size method of observable lists And if that's equal to 2, that tells me that both option 1 and option 2 are selected. And so if that's true, then I can go ahead and just say, with my label, we'll go ahead and set the text to say option 1 and option 2. And we'll go ahead and adjust this to be an else if, and we'll continue to use the second and third conditions here to check if just a single item is selected for either just option 1 or just option 2. So we'll go ahead and save this. We'll run it. And so now we initially have option 1. We'll go ahead and change this to just option 2. We'll go ahead and adjust accordingly. So we can still alternate between the two of them. And now if I go ahead and hold down the control key and select option 2 as well, so we've got both of them selected, and we see our label updating to say option 1 and option 2. So we can go ahead and modify this in 3 different ways based on that. Okay, so at this point, this is going to wrap up everything for the sort of introduction to the ListView control, where we got to see a little bit about just creating it, setting up the preferred dimensions for it, adding some items to it, and then being able to select those and use this event listener to kind of update a label. In the next video, what I want to go ahead and take a look at is going to be working with the ListView alongside things like arrays and array lists, either for being able to create a list view from either of those, or using the list view to kind of to create either of those.